Public and seek agreement agenda items 4, 6 and 7 are recorded by Hansard.
Agreed.
Apologies have been received by Michaela Boyle. Any other apologies? No. Draft minutes, pages 5 to 11. Members content the record. Agreed.
Agreed.
Matters arising. Refer members summary table request for information at page 13 of your packs. Moving straight into the flexible work and inquiry. Stakeholder evidence via Videolink. Advise members that the session will be conducted via Skype. And as this has only been used once before in the committee setting, there may be some teething problems. Can I ask members to remain as quiet as possible whenever a question is being directed to the witness to avoid interference in the audio feed? Members should also ask one question at a time and speak at a slower than normal pace, as there may well be a slight time delay in transmission. It may assist the witness if members introduce themselves at the beginning of asking their questions as well. So I can refer members to Cabinet Office Guide to Smart Working in Government, pages 15 to 74 of your packs, and to the suggested areas for discussion, pages 4 to 5 of tabled papers. Okay, members, can I welcome to the meeting Andy Lake, who is the Director of Flexible.co.uk Limited. Andy, you're very welcome to this morning's meeting.
Sorry, can you say that again?
You're very welcome to the meeting. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can now, yeah. Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Andy, I wonder, before we go on to questions, could you perhaps give us a brief overview of the work that you have been involved in terms of flexible working, and in particular the document that members have before them, the way we work, a guide to smart working in government?
Yeah, I've been working in this field for nearly 20 years now. Flexibility.co.uk began life as part of a European R&D project funded under the framework programmes, looking at telework for people with disabilities, telework in remote rural areas, telework in the construction industry, things like that. And Flexibility was a monthly paper journal looking at all aspects of the projects and business innovation. And it just kept on going, and with sponsorship from various organisations and from the European Commission, and eventually became self-financing and was spun out as a separate company. And so apart from keeping abreast of what's happening in the changing world of work and carrying out sponsored research, I'll tell you a bit more about some of that later, some of the current stuff. Also increasingly being asked to advise companies and help them to implement flexible working or smart working or agile working in practice. We produced something a couple of years ago called the Smart Working Handbook, which had sponsorship from a number of leading organisations. That's still downloadable from the website. And as a result of that, a number of organisations have asked for it to be customised as their internal guidance. And in due course, the Cabinet Office approached me and said, this is pretty much what we'd like to do. So can you customise a version of this, sort of going to talk to all the people in the relevant departments in the UK government, in the English government, and then get a lot of case studies. And this is the version which has got approval, is not yet published, and there's a summary version being prepared at the moment to give kind of quicker guidance as well. And working with a number of large organisations at the moment, utilities and several other councils. I've also done things like did some remote training for the Iranian civil service, which seems, quite random in a way. But they published a few years ago a teleworking decree, because seeing it as remote working as being essential for modernising their government. So there's a movement underway amongst governments of all kinds to try and modernise the way they work and work better with less resource, I think, is the key to what it's about.
And in terms of the Westminster government policies, are they driving smart, flexible working in Whitehall departments, e.g. the Civil Service Reform Plan, TW3, National Property Controls, etc.? Are they driving them as much as they can, or do you find there's a resistance there among civil servants? Certainly we find here locally that there have been some comments made by civil servants which would indicate that they would be resistant to going down the road of flexible working.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a drive towards it across departments. I think there's always a process of understanding exactly what it is. Everyone comes to the table with their own ideas of what flexible working is from their own experience, and often from quite a fairly narrow view of it in terms of what their experience is. I don't mean narrow-minded. I mean kind of it. They see it as something about work-life balance and flexible working by exception, rather than trying to get the whole organisation more flexible as normal. In terms of resistance within the government, as I'm sure you know, government departments are often sort of quite autonomous, and they have their own arrangements for property, for HR, for procurement, for technology. And so there's very much a multi-speed and quite diverse set of things happening. But there's definitely an overarching drive from within within Whitehall as part of the efficiency and reform programme under which this initiative sits. I think one of the driving factors, has to be said in government, as in many other organisations, is to reduce property costs. But it's not only that. If you start off a project from that basis, then everyone becomes disaffected from the start, feeling that they're losing something. Whereas I think the whole approach is, how can we do things better, while at the same time being less wasteful with the resources that we have and that we've acquired over the years or even centuries.
Good morning, Andy. If I could perhaps ask one of the most obvious questions, and that's to do with managing performance. Obviously that focuses on results and outcomes. How can that be achieved? What are the difficulties?
In a sense, this is one of the most fundamental questions, and it's important to kind of, when people go through this process, to reflect on how they manage now. Because managing performance, managing by results, understanding what your outputs should be, understanding what the outcomes that you want in the longer term are, is essential to all management. And it's interesting when I do workshops about this, people sort of come in with this is what we do anyway, and then it's kind of, well, how do you do it? So it's quite interesting that people who are in, say, a sales role or some kind of field role are often much clearer on this because it's often very target-driven. There are a lot of people in field work who just do this kind of naturally. The challenge is, in a way, bringing this into a white-collar office environment where people are much more used to managing by presence and feeling that if they just look over someone's shoulder or call someone into the room and have a quick chat, they're actually managing performance. So it's part of it being more structured altogether, sometimes breaking down things that you think is just what you do anyway into a series of projects with definable objectives and outcomes. And there's a lot of techniques for developing this. Obviously, some kind of roles, perhaps those of a more processy variety, are much more amenable to being divided up easily, whereas someone who's perhaps in a social work role may feel that it's impossible. But it's not. There are various councils who have led the way on doing this kind of thing and examining how much is it we actually do? What do we expect people to achieve within a certain amount of time, the input measures, and with these amount of resources? So you can get some kind of average feel? I don't really like the whole league tables and targets type of approach. It's something much more subtle and sort of worked out at a team basis.
Obviously, some are going to be easier, as you've just said, Andy, to monitor than others. Which are the most difficult types of job to actually see performance coming from?
I think it's sometimes in the roles which are of a more reactive nature, and so sometimes there are people in roles who have to troubleshoot and deal with unexpected crises and things like that as well. Again, it's a question of looking at the wider picture and seeing what is the normal kind of things one would expect. But I think one of the key issues here is that people feel that if someone is remote, they are out of contact, and that is changing. In the current situation, if somebody is not at their desk or is in a meeting or visiting someone, they're effectively out of contact. But with the new technologies, somebody who is working from home or working in the field, working anywhere, is available through the kind of technologies we're using now. A lot of organizations using things like Microsoft Link or other similar things to keep in touch, where you've unified communications, where you can contact by instant messaging and set up instant conference calls wherever you are. So being out of the office doesn't mean out of touch. Properly managed, it means being more available than before, I think.
I guess the big problem for some managers is that how do we know that our actual staff member is working all of the time?
That's well, that touches a number of fundamental points, I think, really, isn't it? It's that, do you really want to measure someone's value to the organisation in terms of time that they're working, particular times, or by the results? Obviously, they will be working for a certain amount of time. Within that time, you will set objectives which will take up a certain amount of time. But to focus on the time inputs rather than the productive outputs is kind of part of the old world of work that we need to move away from, I think.
Okay, thank you, Anne.
I was going to say, it sort of reminds me of politicians. You don't see them at work, but you judge them on their outcomes as opposed to monitoring them day in, day out. Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Morning, Andy. Andy, how can we ensure that there's a commitment at the top level of any organisation for flexible working?
Support at the top. Well, it is absolutely crucial. I've seen quite a number of organisations which have started down the road, and then people at the top, they may say the right words, but they're not doing it, and then things start to fall apart. And I give quite a sort of challenging example in a way. If you're moving to smart working environments and you're saying that space is allocated according to need rather than to status, then you're going to do things like get rid of private offices, turn them into meeting rooms and things like that. Or how does the chief executive or how do ministers react to this? And if you have people at the top who say, yes, it's good to have people working flexibly, but then they get really upset and saying, where is everybody today? And then you've got a problem. So they have to lead by example. And usually one of the first things that I do when I go into an organisation is work with people right at the top in sort of senior management, awareness raising, and looking at what other organisations are doing, look at the issues and getting that buy-in, and then developing a set of a vision and a set of principles which is signed off at the top. It's quite sort of top level, as you've seen in the handbook. But then that becomes a kind of touchstone on which how work is organised at a lower level, how the decisions are made about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Is there any lessons that we can learn from the case studies that you've carried out?
Yes. I think that one of the most important things is getting people in, after getting that high-level vision, is getting the people who work in the sometimes separate fields of property, technology, and HR, the people disciplines, working together as an integrated team. And quite often I've seen people who they're getting something going, but the technology people have their, for example, they might be on the right track, but they've got their own roadmap. They've got their 5-year strategy. They've got a contract with an external provider, and so they've got certain things pretty much set in stone that they won't shift on. And they say, yeah, we'll do this in a good time. But getting those people all working together to introduce a sort of coherent program to support the cultural changes that are needed, that's often one of the most difficult things.
Yeah, and it's important to get that in early, I suppose, till the whole
It
project.
is, yeah. And so the structure and governance of the change project is quite important in having someone at a senior enough level to say, enough of this silo working, let's all do this together.
Thanks, Andy.
Deputy Chair.
Thanks, sir. Morning, Andy.
Good morning.
Andy, could I ask you, for a company or indeed, let's say, a government department who were setting out afresh to implement smart or flexible working, what would the key steps, the initial key steps be in your experience?
Well, at the back of that document, at the back of the Smart Working Handbook, I set out a sort of sample, sort of a generic timeline of the steps that are needed. First of all is the awareness raising and the vision and principles being established. But I think also there's a whole step of gathering the evidence, seeing how people are working now, seeing what resources they're using, how much offices are occupied, what technologies they're using, what are their needs in terms of mobility, and then engaging the workforce in this process so that it's not something happening to them. So actually asking them, how could you do what you do better if you had the right set of tools and you had a bit more flexibility to organise these in a way that you think is more rational and that will fit in better with your kind of life. And it's quite amazing the results that you get out of that, because I think that in my experience in the public sector, it's full of committed and intelligent and caring and creative people, but who spend a lot of their time doing things which they feel are not entirely necessary. The kind of systems and processes and places that they do things. And they do it because it's kind of what's always been done, kind of because maybe they're worried about stepping out of line and being accountable to various other people for doing something wrong. And they know that things can be improved. So part of the way to make a success of it, I think, is to engage people's creativity in energy in redesigning the way they work. And I go through a process with them of what I call the CAN test. That's challenging assumptions of necessity. Challenging the why. Why are you doing this at all? Why are you doing it here? Why are you doing it at this particular time? And then looking at how can you do it in a lighter way, much more light on resources, and all that kind of thing. And people can come up with quite empowering answers. But part of the process of getting to that is getting managers to be able to trust their staff in a way to work in ways where they have a bit more choice about where and when and how they work. And they can do that if they're happy to manage by results.
Okay, thank you. You described the more traditional workplace setting and the way it's managed as presence management, as opposed, I suppose, to distance management. In the traditional setting, one would think that it's easier to avoid fragmentation, isolation, loss of team spirit, and in some cases the threat to the work-life balance. How do you ensure that these elements are not part of the smart or flexible working plan?
Yeah. I think you're right to point out that there are some dangers if you go, say, if your focus is, for example, entirely on home working, which our sort of surveys inside organisations show that most people don't want to do. It's if you ask people how much they would like to work at home, it's like up to 1 to 2 days a week for those who want to do it. It's a very small number who want to work 3 to 5 days a week, even though it can be sometimes quite an efficient way to organise things. So. One has to sort of be careful not to set up arrangements where people are artificially fragmented and dispersed. So I think in a normal kind of flexible working arrangement, or smart working arrangement, people will see each other more often than they imagine compared to what their thoughts or fears might have been. I think the other thing about it is that when a team is together, I mean, the idea is to have this sort of team spirit, but the structures that we have in offices of ranks of desks are not very well suited to collaboration. And having the kind of spaces for collaboration where people can get together and have good access to them, whether it's a breakout space or a project room or a formal meeting room, or these are often quite lacking in government offices. So by having people sharing desks, because desks are underused anyway, and having a range of different settings, people are more able to go to the kind of places that are appropriate for the collaboration that builds team spirit. And again, there are techniques for managing more dispersed teams. And the way I think of a distributed team is not just people who are out in the field, it's everybody who's in that team. So wherever you work from, you're part of the one team and you're all distributed. So you have to learn to work more with the new technologies and rethink meetings, how meetings are done. So rather than, I mean, one of the things that often finds that people complain of a meetings culture, yet spend half their time arranging meetings and more meetings. So how can you start to deconstruct meetings and do things in a different way? Like never having a meeting to share information, for example. You know, that you share that information online beforehand. I'm sure you've all been to meetings where you've had information for the first time. You can't really make a decision on it, so you arrange another meeting. You have meetings where you sit in for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours for 10 minutes. So thinking how you can use the new technologies more creatively to call somebody in remotely for that 10 minutes that they need to be in a meeting. All these are the kind of things which can help to change the way that teams work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Mitchell?
Good morning, Andy, and thanks very much.
Good morning.
I suppose the question of the change management from, say, traditional working practices, existing portfolio of accommodation, the default position of open space is reflected in your document. Is it always possible to retrofit existing buildings, or does experience indicate that sometimes we have to look for alternative accommodation and dispense with some of the existing accommodations?
Yeah, I think there's that can be a choice. So just hesitating, I'm getting a bit of an echo back of my own words, so tripping me up a little bit with my own words.
With your own words.
Yes, I think in a lot of historic buildings, it's often not possible to retrofit because you can't make the internal changes that are needed. Although, if you go to Whitehall, they've done some really quite creative things with some of their older buildings there, and using what were private or smaller team offices as meeting rooms and project rooms and all that kind of thing. I think a lot of the offices built, especially between the 60s and the 90s, really, because they haven't got the kind of wiring and things that are needed, they're often very difficult to deal with, and it's best to get out of them and have something which is more purpose-built. And there are a lot of great examples of purpose-built buildings, which are quite exciting environments for people to go to and work in, as well as being more suited to the new ways of working.
We've had some limited experience of smart working here in the north, and there are significant factors in terms of institutional resistance, workforce kind of resentment of, say, the open plan kind of concepts, and difficulties that were hard to kind of program out. But does experience, in your opinion, require that what we should start with is the best exemplar that we can to demonstrate, A, that it works, B, that there is greater efficiencies and output, I suppose competitiveness, depending on the type of work environment, and then allow the, if you like, the managers who have yet to be convinced that in fact it might require investment in bespoke building design as opposed to going through phased refurbishment.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and having some visits to places which are doing it well can be a first step. And if you're able to set up some kind of a model office within an existing building, which showing the kind of layouts and facilities that people would have, and get some teams to fast track the new ways of working, that can be very influential. And
I suppose workplace culture is a significant issue, particularly for the civil service, where there tends to be longevity, career from leaving education through to perhaps decades working in the same type of environment. Have you found that to be a significant problem to overcome?
In some organisations, I mean, I think it's, people talk a lot about the different generations of the workforce, and the new generations coming through being more au fait with the new technologies and much more happy to work with people and be friends with people that they don't see on a daily basis. While I think that's true, it hasn't really been my experience that the older workforce is necessarily resistant. I mean, a lot of the people driving some of these changes are people, in their sort of, like me, I suppose, mid-50s to retirement age and even beyond. So, and I think the people who are developing these new technologies are often older people as well. But I think that the familiarity is one of the hardest cultural things to get over. But I think there's other forms. Flexible working isn't all about the smart working. Isn't all about the the remote working. There's other forms as well. And with people increasingly working beyond a retirement age and wanting to have phased retirement and things like that, I think there are other kinds of flexibility which can be appealing as well. When we've done surveys on how much people want particular kinds of flexible working, people who want part-time working, reduced hours working the most, tend to be the over 45s, rather than necessarily people who are parents, which is what one might assume. But I think that's because people who are parents have probably already got the part-time working that they want. So I think ways to address different kinds of change in different parts of the working population is quite an important component of this.
And you would argue that the evidence of this smart working in terms of outputs should, in fact, at the end of the day, overcome any reservations or resistance to this step change?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think to be fair, there's a lot of resistance identified amongst middle managers in particular, and team leaders who are often in the position where they're doing a professional job that they've done well for years, and they feel that they haven't had training in managing change. So I think an ideal project has a central resource which will go out and sit with the people who have got to be at the sharp end of change and work with them to help them through the kind of practical changes that they'll be looking at, and to help them design the new ways of working and be in place to support them as they sort of get these new practices bedded in. So I think the kind of field of dreams approach, where you kind of build it and they will come, doesn't really work. I think about a number of projects where they build the platform for flexible working in terms of the new working environments, the new technologies, and then it doesn't quite happen. And that's when perhaps late in the day, they call in someone like me to help with the cultural change because they've kind of forgotten that bit. So having that bit of the cultural change within the change management is very vital.
I think we've learned that first lesson ourselves through experience. Thank you very much.
Judith?
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested specifically in the potential for sharing workspaces across sort of different government departments or local government and public bodies. How much of that has gone on in GB so far? And also, are there other benefits associated with it apart from just, you know, perhaps reducing costs because buildings are being better utilised? I mean, is there any evidence of government starting to work less in silos because there is an interaction at times, even in an informal sense, between people from other departments?
Yeah, very much so. I think the desk sharing is one of the biggest fears because it really attacks something quite emotionally central to people, because at one level it's about territory. You know, this is my territory, and you're taking my desk away, you're taking our storage away, or something like this. But it's also can be felt as an attack on identity. This is, you know, this is about where I have my my work personality. This is my team and you know, people that I associate with. So it's important to sort of recreate a team identity in the new guys. But the desk sharing is very, I would say it's becoming almost ubiquitous in the UK public sector, you know, over here, in central government, called by various names like non-territorial working, and pretty much throughout local government, it's either there or it's on its way. Does it have those advantages? I think it has many advantages, and in the case studies, obviously using space more effectively is quite important. When you've got an average of just about 40% of desks actually used during the sort of working day, 9 to 5, not counting lunchtime, those are the kind of figures that you're seeing. That is an enormous amount of waste, and that's resource that can be spent on something else. So I think people are persuaded by those kind of arguments when they see the evidence. Case studies like in the booklet, like from DCMS, how they're using their new project areas, that is very good at sort of bringing together and getting team identity from people who come in from a variety of different departments. And one of the kind of wins that you can often get in a project when you're moving to this kind of working is, I'm sure you've got many cases in many departments and throughout local government as well, I would think, where teams are dispersed across multiple sites. So actually being able to bring those people to have a single base, even if they don't work there all the time, is a big bonus for many managers and the teams themselves.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Andy, for coming and being here this morning this way. In relation to the technology, and appreciate that I'm not necessarily bought into the total flexible working approach. Sometimes I see it as a Skyver's charter in some way, but I believe in the smarter working aspect of things, and those that have the ability to do it and to use it. What mechanisms are there to ensure that all of the technologies are secure and safe when they're being used in remote settings, and how can it be married together to ensure that that does happen?
This is quite an interesting one, because the government deals with very sensitive information. The Cabinet Office has been working on sort of new definitions of different security levels. So it's a question of finding the appropriate forms of working and the appropriate forms of technology for according to what the security needs are. I think sometimes it's used as a kind of, because some things might be too sensitive to take off site, then that can be used as an objection to smarter working as a whole. So it's a question of finding, what's the proportionate response. The way the advice within Whitehall is, it's a question of managing the risk, not sort of blocking everything that you might do. I think it's quite interesting as well that one of the pioneers of flexible working, smart working is GCHQ. And when you think about it, your intelligence organizations and military are constantly taking very, very sensitive information all around the place. So that the techniques are out there. It's just a question of, again, of how can we do something which we already know how to do in a white-collar office environment.
It can sometimes be seen as a reason not to do it. And I think of some organisations who just say, well, the security risks are too great, and by that I mean data security is too great, so therefore they don't offer the opportunity, or it just seems like too much work to try and deliver it. Have you encountered any of that resistance?
I have. I don't know that I should mention specifics. I know, one government organisation which is, has moved quite substantially towards smarter working, but one element of them isn't as yet. What they're doing is thinking, well, we have to deal with very difficult and sensitive issues here, to do with public security and so on. We will continue to work in our traditional ways for the moment, and sort of look at what will be the appropriate solutions for us. They, for example, are very resistant to sharing space with other parts of the organisation. And I can see the wisdom of that in terms of sharing the regular places where you work, where you might be overheard and things like that. But there are some common areas where they are now, which they are now sharing. Some of the other activity-based work settings that I mentioned. So you can take people along at their own speed, but there may be genuine things where you just can't do it.
Thank you. Andy, as I alluded to earlier, senior departmental officials in the Department of Finance and personnel here have a number of concerns about flexible work, and I wonder if you could just give us a quick view on three of these concerns. One, too much flexibility can have an adverse impact on business arrangements. Two, that a formalised home working policy risks creating a sense of entitlement and inflexibility on the part of employees. And three, that informal ad hoc arrangements where line managers exercise discretion is preferable.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, to some extent, I agree with all of those in respect to how flexible working has been done so far. I think that the process whereby somebody applies for a flexible working arrangement, which kind of gets set in stone, and that's an exception from normal working, you can't really construct a strategy on that basis. You're kind of working from the basis of having a default norm of 9 to 5 working in the office, and this is how you do business. And then one person's got this alternative arrangement, one person's got that alternative arrangement, and all of this adds up to complexity and, to my mind, a bit of incoherence. It can also lead to some, in a sense, discriminatory practices, because one line manager will accept this and one line manager won't accept the same. You have two people sitting next to each other. One has caring responsibilities, one doesn't. One gets some kind of flexibility, and it's seen as a kind of benefit. So I think that the proper approach is to move forward from that and try and get away from this default traditional normal, and think how in the new world of work that's emerging, with all its more flexible possibilities in terms of where people work, how can we create something which works for our team, where people can work in different ways at different times, rather than nailing something down, as a kind of permanent contractual arrangement.
I really want to take it into the direction of health as well. Obviously, the committee here are currently looking at the issue of the amount of public service workers' sick days across our various departments, which is an issue for concern. But obviously there's a number of areas that need considered, and there's reference in the report on page 40 of your report to healthy working in terms of sick days lost, unhealthy working environment, stress, and even having sick family members or sick children within a household can have an impact as well. Is there recognition that flexible working can be part of the public health agenda as well? Because obviously healthier workers and workers with more time can have more time to be healthy as well, because one of the big issues that we're all facing at the minute is increased health spending projected over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Diabetes rates going up quite considerably here across the north year on year. Can this be a key part of that agenda?
I think it can. There's been quite a lot of studies linking flexible working to better health outcomes, and in particular related to reducing stress and having beneficial effects in terms of people who've got sort of problems with blood pressure and things like that. There's also some studies which are indicating that those forms of flexible working which give greater autonomy to the person are the most effective at reducing stress. So that's something which I think ties in with the culture of trust, which I was mentioned, and the feeling of being empowered, rather than something where you're feeling that what you're doing is in some way different from the normal, and it may be causing problems for other people in the office. So having that kind of empowerment involved is also quite important. I mean, I think one of the other things which I find interesting from a policy point of view is in terms of the most dangerous thing that you'll do at work, and apart from if you're a soldier or a policeman or a mine or a fireman, something like this, the most dangerous thing you'll do is drive to and from work, or travel anyway to and from work. That's the greatest, and that doesn't really come into the figures somehow. It doesn't count as a work-related accident if you're injured, or killed going to or from work. So reductions in commuting, which are also a source of stress, I would strongly associate with a health agenda.
Okay then, members. Andy, that's all from us for now. Can I thank you very much for your time? It's been a very productive session, and this will go some way to improving our final report. So can I thank you very much?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I wish you well in your endeavours.
Okay. All the best. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye now.
Okay, members, we're now going to move on to the next item on the agenda, briefing from Assembly Research on Capital. Can I advise members due to mistake in Table 1 of the original research paper and amended paper at page 7 to 23 of your table papers. Can I also ask that this research paper be sent to other committees for their information? Great. Okay, can I welcome Pamela Dugdale to the committee. Pamela, you want to give us a brief overview of the paper?
Thank you, Chair. This briefing seeks to increase members' understanding of the Financial Transactions Capital Scheme, which is used to fund infrastructure investment in Northern Ireland. I will be happy to take questions at the end. The paper on Financial Transactions Capital is formatted in the following manner. Section 1 is just a little bit of background. Section 2 includes an overview of the scheme and some detail on the projects that are currently funded. Section 3 is the advantages and disadvantages of the scheme. Section 4 provides some comparisons to other methods of funding infrastructure. And Section 5 is conclusions. Some key points. The funds may only be deployed as a loan to or equity investment in the private sector. An important point to note at this juncture is this includes charities and universities. Also, financial transactions capital has to be repaid to Treasury. However, if it is not used for loan or equity investment, it has to be surrendered, which is similar to DEL funding. Some background, Section 1. The 2013 budget, the Chancellor announced a £3.5 billion Help to Buy scheme for England only. Therefore, those are not consequentials awarded to the devolved administrations. But there was a condition attached to these consequentials. The scheme must work. Any scheme devised by the administrations had to work in a similar way to the Help to Buy scheme in the UK. The funding allocation is approximately 247 million over 4 years at the present time. Section 2 of the report provides the overview of the scheme and begins with the definition of financial transactions capital, or policy lending as it's also known. It then continues on with some key features of the scheme. One feature is that any scheme must be supportive of the executive's aims and objectives. Then it goes on with some incentives. Although repayable to Treasury, it's not fully repayable. For example, the 2012 allocation is at 60%, repayable to Treasury. In this, the way this works is that the department repays 80% of the funding to DFP and retains half of the difference, 20%, and then DFP retains a further 20% and pays 60% to Treasury. As a point of scrutiny, the committee may wish to ask DFP what is meant by manage the overall position as regards the use of this funding and what the money is likely to be spent on. Also, any scheme must comply with EU state aid rules. However, DFP have stated that the DEDI EU support unit will be able to provide advice to ensure compliance with this. Currently, projects funded, DEDI's funding an agri-food loan scheme. DSD are funding a number of schemes like the Empty Home Scheme, an Affordable Home Loan Scheme, and Get Britain Building. And DEL announced in January a loan to the University of Ulster Greater Belfast Development Scheme. Also, the Department of Health is currently providing loans to GPs and dentists to improve practices and equipment. Details of the allocations under each of these schemes for each year are provided on page 8 of the paper. Also, end-of-year flexibility has been agreed between Treasury and DFP separately for this type of funding. Currently, we are within the limits. Section 3, advantages and disadvantages. Initially, I broke down the advantages into two, Treasury perspective and the Northern Ireland perspective, but I'll focus mainly on the Northern Ireland perspective because that's what we're mostly interested in. It is additional capital funding and it's available to all departments. It could help stimulate the growth of the private sector. Also, it's not a one-time only investment. Funding can be recycled, although the committee may wish to seek DFP's view on whether the time frame of projects will enable this type of recycling. Disadvantages. The main one is that it's not easily understood. It's hard to get to grips with. DFP and SIB are currently having to drive forward schemes. Also, departments may be reluctant to address the whole concept of the funding. And departments will carry the risk of default on these schemes within their own budgets. Section 4 just provides some background and some comparisons to other methods of funding infrastructure, conventional capital, PFI initiatives, the Reinvestment and Reform Initiative, the UK Guarantee Fund, etc. As Section 5 is the conclusion. This is additional capital funding, and DFP and SIB have both suggested that its use will continue into the future. If it's not used, it will have to be surrendered to Treasury. If the Northern Ireland Executive does not embrace the opportunity that this funding presents, it will be lost. Although, we have to keep in mind the constraints that are detailed within Section 3, which may make that unavoidable. Now I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much, Pamela. It's a very interesting overview paper. Thanks very much for that. In terms of page 6 of the research paper, there's obviously reference there to the repayment rates.
Yes.
Repayment rate of 80% is assumed by the department. When would we expect clarification in regard to that? I mean, it's been 60% for 2012, it says there.
Yes.
But is it 99% certain it's going to be 80% in the next
I haven't
years?
been informed. I was speaking to Treasury and DFP officials, and at the minute no agreement has been reached. I can make further inquiries if you'd like.
And then in terms of, it's a very useful illustration to give a sense of how money's been passed back and forward between the department, Treasury and the benefiting project. In terms of the repayments, what is the time scale, or when do the repayments have to be put in?
That would be agreed as part of the scheme between the department and the private sector.
But does it have to be before the end of that 4-year period, or you know?
No information has been given at the present time.
Okay. Any other members? Is it?
Yep. Yeah, thank you very much for that. There were two points occurred to me. One, in fact, has occurred for a long time, and I've asked the Minister several times about it, and that is to actually get the maximum advantage of this. We have to have real and practical working with the private sector. I've asked them what steps have been taken or what plans have been put in place to ensure that that can happen, because obviously a project doesn't come out of thin air like that. There's a long lead-in time. So to make use of this capital, and I believe it's a useful resource, we have to plan for it. Have we done any planning yet?
SIB and DFP have been promoting this as a method of funding, and in evidence to the committee, they have suggested, or they have said that they have approached a number of private sector organisations, including the airports, to suggest. So there are a number of things that they're trying to do. SIB, as you know, have an infrastructure paper that for the next next couple of years. So I presume that they would be looking at that, and departments should be looking at what they have on their on their agendas for the next couple of years to see what they could, because as you can see from the paper, if they can take things off that are already funded, you know, with or capital that is already in place, they can retain 50% of that funding, and then only have to return another 50%. So there are things in place, but I'm not sure what.
The trouble with that is that's only one side of it.
Yes.
That's trying to reshape public projects
Yes.
to tie them into the private sector to attract the funding.
Well, there will always have to have an element of the public sector involvement, because it has to promote public sector's aims and objectives, the executive's aims and objectives.
But I mean, the lack of the relocation of the University of Ulster was just fortunate, is the word for it.
I think so.
Absolutely. I mean, they couldn't have used the money anywhere else, and that actually leads me very neatly to the second question. And that is that, you know, to a certain extent, financial transaction capital competes with the reinvestment and reform initiative.
I think it could be used as a complement to it rather than to compete with it.
But you could use both sources of funds for similar projects.
You actually use both types of funding on the same project. So
That's right, too, yeah.
You could actually, and that obviously, hopefully it'll complement one another rather than to fight with one another.
Big problem for me certainly still remains is how we get the private sector to share with us their future plans, so in fact that we can tee into them in sufficient time to make it work.
I believe SIB are actually publishing their infrastructure paper on what their hopes and aims for Northern Ireland on the web, so that the public sector or the private sector can actually become involved in some of the big projects.
I think it takes more than that, but thanks very much.
Okay, Mitchell.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and the paper's very helpful in seeking to understand it. I suppose the profile of our economy creates a fairly unique challenge about using this type of funding, in that we have an economy that's completely dominated by the public sector. And you know, it's very arguable, even setting aside the issue of productivity and competitiveness of our private sector, whether we have the type of capital investment schemes of a scale that could take full advantage of this. So to that extent, I'm just wondering, what is the experience in Wales and Scotland and perhaps the northern region in terms of, you know, where they possibly have a different economic profile from ourselves that might throw up ideas that we might necessarily turn to immediately?
Well, the only scheme in the north of England is the Help to Buy scheme.
Right.
That covers the whole of...
And that was the origins of the concept?
That was the origin of the concept. Scotland and Wales are actually further behind the curve than we are so far. I did seek some information on projects that they were funding, but as yet they're sort of a wee bit further behind the curve. So. Okay.
Now we need to talk to SIB. Okay, thanks very much, Pamela, anyway, because it is actually, I think, quite an important piece of work. This. Yeah. Thank you.
Adrian?
Chair, Pamela, very good paper there. And, you know, it was a good insight into the whole role, this whole thing here. 5.9, the end of year flexibility, 5.9 million was carried over this year. And it says, you know, that you have to carry over less than 20%. What happens if you go over 20%? What happens to it?
It'll be surrendered to Treasury.
And it's just lost money to that stage?
Well, Treasury will say thank you very much.
Surely. And you know the frameworks and all you have to go into to set up a public-private partnership with us here?
It's not a public-private partnership. That is a different thing entirely. This is the private sector are in control of these projects. There will be contracts. DFP have said in evidence to the committee that they would be willing periodically to come back and give updates on projects that are in the pipeline at the minute, but I presume because of the private sector nature of them, that perhaps they wouldn't want to publicise them before the contracts were signed.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the length of time it would take a contract to sign. Is that any bearing on?
Well, that is one of the issues that I had said is a disadvantage. You know,
Yes.
that there is an element of bureaucracy. But DFP have stated that they would hope to have a few more projects signed up before summer recess.
And there's no way of cutting down that bureaucracy that you see?
I would say it would be important to have everything contractualised.
Thanks, Jay.
Adrian? In terms of the qualifying criteria, obviously it has to be a private sector entity, and reference is made on page 5. Defined by ONS classification that includes charities and universities. How wide is that qualifying criteria? I mean, if you're talking about organisations from the third sector, etc.
Yes, those would be applicable.
They would be applicable.
They would be allowed to partake of this type of funding.
Yeah. Okay. What about community organisations? Certain types? Or
Social economy projects.
I would say it would depend, obviously, on how they were set up as an organisation. It is important that the lead on any project is private sector.
yeah.
So if they had an element of local government, obviously then that would make them ineligible. So it would depend on how the organisation itself was set up.
Mitchell?
It's just another question that occurs to me, which is, instead of just a straightforward loan, you can also take equity. And what happens when you capitalise the equity? What happens to that finance?
You mean when you sell it?
Yeah.
It goes back to the department.
Doesn't go back to Treasury?
It'll go back to the department initially, and then depending on the repayment.
Say the repayment is made in full or up to 80%, 60%, whatever it is. Subsequent to that, the equity is capitalised. What happens to the other money? Is it retained by?
Well, I'll just speak because I'm not quite sure. The 2012 allocation, it was 60%. So if 100% comes back when the equity is realised, the department will pay back 80% to DFP and retain the 20% for their own
No,
use.
I'm talking a slightly different concept, which is that
Well, they
the
can
loan
use
is
that.
repaid under whatever kind of percentage terms are applied. Done and dusted, we move on. The money's reallocated or whatever. But the initial capital project continues to exist, in which there is some equity stake.
There won't be an equity stake because they've repaid it.
There's got to be.
Owned by them.
Don't understand that.
There's got to be an equity stake.
There still would be an equity stake.
The equity is
Well, the equity stake will be surrendered in order to repay.
No, I'm saying no. They're repaying it as a cash repayment arrangement over perhaps a period of time that is agreed.
And they've left the equity there.
The equity is left there beyond the terms of the agreement. So the whatever the capital investment project is in itself is existing as an entity in which there has been an equity stake established at the very beginning. The loan has been repaid, done and dusted.
Well, it's either a loan or an equity investment. So if it's a loan, the loan will be repaid. If it's an equity investment, it will be liquidised to repay the department. Does that answer?
That's probably my fault. I didn't understand how that works.
Am I just
Can you
picking it up
maybe
wrong?
a wee bit of clarification on that point, because I always see an asset as holding some value, and at some stage you can either realise the value that's in that, and if that is the equity of it. But no matter what you do, we expect the equity to always retain what has been loaned against it, or if not grow. Unless you're going through a recession for property prices or whatever assets are going down. I cannot get my head around the fact that if you do pay off your equity stake in it, if they say they will 40% of the bill or 50%, and you actually say, well, look, let's clear that equity stake, and the private sector or the whoever's funding it comes up with the finances to actually clear that, what happens with the additional equity that's within the property? Do you have any hold on it? And the other point being, if the money is paid back, does it go back to, if it's not reprofiled within the year that it's paid, does it end up having to be passed back to Whitehall? My point is, if somebody makes an investment, pays it back, and pays it back within the period of time, can that money be reprofiled and recirculated for other projects?
The information from DFP says yes, it can be reprofiled and reused for other projects, but that was one of the points of scrutiny, to inquire the life cycle, the time frames of the current projects, how much availability there is for that type of recycling. That was one of the issues that I suggested that might be worthy of the committee questioning DFP. But I'll take down that information on the equity investment.
Well, is your information that it's either a loan or equity? It can't be a combination or a mixture of either?
My understanding is that it's one or the other.
But if we have a situation, and this is really stretching it a bit, but just to work it out, I'm interested in the fact that the Treasury doesn't claw back 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say, for the purpose of discussion, there's what they require paid back is 80%. That 20%, as described by yourself, would be divided between the sponsoring department and the DFP in terms of the centre, whatever that means.
It's my favourite one.
Yeah. So there is 20% in an individual project is retained, which is a pot of money at initial stage. There could be simultaneous projects, 1, 2, 3 or 4 investments of this type. And one of them could be an equity interest in a particular project. There is 20% divided between 2 of our departments that is retained from the purely cash, the capital investment, that could keep Treasury sweet. That actually kind of manages their 80% repayment across a number of schemes. Yeah. And the equity is preserved until such time as the executive decides that they're going to liquidise it or not.
Well, certainly my understanding is that it would all be liquidised at that time, and because the departments will actually, their budget will be reduced by that element.
Even if they pay.
If I was Tom McFeely instead of Mitchell McLaughlin, I'd probably could answer that question. Yeah.
I'm not clear on that, because I actually thought if you had done that, you would have retained the asset and still had the equity there.
That's what I think too.
Providing
it is a productive and profitable investment. Yeah.
Yeah, but surely
it should be whenever it's been funded by.
Is it not really whether the equity is redeemed or not?
Well, my understanding was that the equity would be redeemed at the same time.
So it's paid back, and therefore the interest
it would be
the other party is gone.
But I will make.
I'll not ask the question about how you would decide what the equity was, whether it had appreciated or not, because it makes it worse.
Yeah.
I would say that would be laid down in the contract. You know, how much, that would be laid down in the contract, how much the government would be funding, the executive would be funding, and then how much of the project that would equate to. And therefore, it would be, if it was an equity investment, it would be independently valued at the time that it was being liquidised. That sounds that's an awful term.
It's a bit like shareholding, I guess, isn't it?
Pardon?
A bit like shareholding.
Yes.
So it could appreciate. Anyway, moving quickly along.
Okay, members.
Yes, that's great. Thanks very much.
I'll make further inquiries about retaining the asset.
You've actually provoked us anyway.
Didn't wish to provoke you.
Can I thank you very much for the research paper and answering questions. I forgot to say the members will go easy on you because we're the first time before the committee. You handle yourself well, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members, moving on to the next session, briefing from DFP and residual equal pay grievances. Referring members to documents pages 94 through to 100 of your packs, and copy correspondence from Civil Service Pensioners Alliance, which is at the table papers at page 25. So can I welcome Mark Bailey back to the meeting again. Mark, do you want to give us a few brief comments before we go to questions?
Yes, certainly, Chair, can do. Before I start, Chair, if I can just apologise for my voice. It's a wee bit deeper than it normally is, so my apologies about that, but it sounds worse than it actually is. Although, having said that, if any members have any particularly difficult questions, it may take a turn for the worse. We'll see how we go. By way of a very brief background, I have provided a paper to summarise the issues, and members will be aware. I mean, I'm not obviously going to back through the equal pay settlement, but that was established on the basis of the law at the time, as you're fully aware. I've been here a number of times. The settlement was agreed by the executive in NIPSA and then obviously was implemented back in 2010. Now it was actually the implementation date, although the effective date was back in 2009. That settlement, as you know, excluded two key groups, and those are the two key groups I think you believe you want an update on today. One of those is leavers, and it's those who had left the civil service prior to August 08. You'll be aware of that, but prior to August 08, leavers were excluded from the equal pay settlement, and that was because they had no legal entitlement, and you're aware of that. Likewise, there was a second group, which was the PSNI/NIO group, who were also excluded from the equal pay settlement, and that was also because they had no legal entitlement, albeit for a different basis. They had a pay delegation, and I know you've been round all this ground before and you're aware of that. If I turn now to the two specific groups and maybe deal with them one at a time, if we talk a little bit about leavers, what's happened since 2010, and then PSNI and NIO and what's happened since 2010. In terms of the leavers, first of all, as I outlined very briefly in the paper, there was continual lobbying really from 2010 after the equal pay settlement on behalf of leavers, primarily by the Civil Service Pensioners Alliance. I know had been lobbying, a number of MLAs had been contacted by individuals, but we maintained the line. If nothing through all of this, you may not agree or not agree with officials, but we had a consistent line throughout about the legal entitlement. So you know that was initiated from 2010, but the whole legal landscape changed in 2012 that you're aware because of the Supreme Court judgment in the Abdullah case. So the law changed to allow leavers to take a claim, an equal pay claim, through the civil courts going back 6 years. And again, you'll be familiar with that. On the back of that, NIPSA lodged around about 500 or so, just over 500 writs on behalf of former staff, because they now did have a legal entitlement because the legal position had changed. And we've been negotiating with NIPSA on those writs about trying to find a settlement terms similar to what happened with the equal pay settlement before. It's not identical, but it's a similar sort of terms. And we've come to the conclusion of that negotiation towards the end of last year, put that to the Minister, who approved the settlement terms. And so as a result of that, we're now in a position where we're working with NIPSA to go out to those. There's 450 former staff there. Now, a number of the writs weren't valid for a variety of reasons. There's around about 450 former staff for whom these writs have been submitted. So we now, just to sort of finalise this in terms of so you're aware of the steps and what's happening, it's been agreed by the Minister. NIPSA have contacted those staff within the last week or two. The civil service officials and colleagues of mine have also contacted those staff, and NIPSA are arranging what they're calling road shows in March. So those 450 staff, former staff, will be invited to NIPSA road shows.
Just before moving on to that point, it's the 450. Were they only ones who brought themselves forward and identified themselves to NIPSA? Are there others who were not necessarily part of that initial point who could well be there but have not come above the radar?
Yes, and well, let me clarify that because there's two parts to that question. The 450 were the ones that NIPSA put forward.
Yeah.
I don't believe those 450 all came to NIPSA. NIPSA, I believe, went through their records and identified former members who would fall into the criteria.
There are many who are not members.
There could well be, absolutely. There are members, many who are not members. So there are a lot more leavers. I think the committee has had details before about the numbers of leavers over this period.
Yes.
So those 450 are a subset of people who left during the 6-year period, yes. But those are the ones for whom a legal entitlement has been established because the writs were lodged. And I'll deal with the little extra group as well. It's pertinent to that. I'll just briefly finish. So NIPSA are running roadshows in the next few weeks for those 450 staff. That's to give them legal advice and to recommend to them that they accept the settlement terms that they've negotiated with DFP. And following that, then we will be writing out to those staff with compromise agreement and seeking details, bank details and photo ID and the usual. We have to make sure obviously we're in contact with the right people. So I would anticipate that providing people agree, individuals agree, we should start seeing some sort of payments coming through, possibly in April or May. It'll take a number of months, but it's up to NIPSA to run these roadshows first, and obviously the documentation has to be in place. So that's the 450 writs. Just finally, on leavers, there are an extra group that were agreed within the settlement, because members will be aware of the 6-year bar that individuals can go back. We agreed the settlement at the beginning of this year, which is January 2014, obviously. If you go back 6 years from January 2014, it takes you back to January 2008, which is some 7 months before our cut-off. You remember our cut-off for the equal pay settlement was August 2008. So when we agreed this settlement, there's a 7-month window of leavers there who could still submit a writ. Anybody who left before January 08 can no longer, that's gone. But those 7 months, so the Minister also agreed that we would extend the settlement terms to those people in that 7-month window. And so we plan to write out to those individuals after. We need to deal with the 450, we need to stage this, but we'll deal with the 450 and then we will write out to the other, I think it's around about 700 or so others who left during that 7-month window. And we will be writing out to them to offer them the same settlement terms that we've negotiated with NIPSA. So that effectively means that's actually consistent and in line with the original equal pay settlement, because
was there not already an offer made at one stage on this whole thing?
No, there's been no, throughout all of this, from the original equal pay settlement, we have maintained the same line that unless there was a legal entitlement, we wouldn't entertain any sort of discussions. And that effectively is a continuation of the same line with that group, it's just the law has changed. So we are putting in arrangements to deal with the writs that NIPSA have lodged, but also to deal with the additional staff who could lodge writs. And as I say, that's in line with the original equal pay settlement, because it actually included 6 months' worth of leavers from the effective date of the original equal pay settlement, because at that time they were able to lodge tribunal claims. So that's an update on the leavers. Now, I'm happy, Chair, to take questions on leavers before we move on to PSNI and NI.
Adrian, you wanted in there?
I just want to ask about anybody that wasn't members of NIPSA. How do we deal with them?
Well, we still are taking the same line of this settlement is where there is a legal entitlement, and that has been crystallised, if you like, through a writ. So those people, I mean, to the member's question before, there are groups of staff who are not included in this. And we've extended this to cover the 700 who could take a claim, but there are still others for whom now the water's under the bridge. If they left before January 2008 and they're not in NIPSA's list of writs, then this settlement doesn't apply to them.
What if they're in the timescale for, if they left after 2008? Do they have to take a writ themselves then? No, because that would add unnecessary cost. And that's why for those extra 700 or so, we will be writing out and offering the same settlement terms. But I'm talking about people who weren't members of NIPSA and maybe know nothing about this. I'm sure they all do know about it now, I'm sure. But if there's some people out there who don't and happen to land up in some of our offices someday asking how do you get involved in this?
Those 700 aren't just members of NIPSA, so we're writing to everybody. Everybody who left on or after January 08 will be covered by this.
Sorry.
Okay. So
I didn't realise it was everybody.
Deputy Chair.
Thanks. Morning. No, you have accurate records, obviously, of all former staff who could bring a claim under the new legal position, and you will be contacting them. So you're sure that no one will be left out of the loop?
Well, all that we can do is we will be writing to their last known address. Obviously, some of these people left 6 years ago now. So the best that we can do is we have got records, obviously, of their address and when they left. So we will be writing out to them. But I have no doubt some of those might prove difficult to trace, because they may well have moved house or could be in another country or whatever. But no, we will do all that we can, and that would mean primarily it'll be writing out to their former address, the last known record that we have. And I mean, that's about as far as we can take it. We'll be relying on them to respond to that, because we've no other way of contacting them.
Well, is there any other way of making people aware that there is this possibility for them?
Media.
Well, I mean, presumably, through the colleague or from the Civil Service Pensioners Alliance or other groups can do this. Is now in the public forum, so in whatever way that people can communicate that there's no issue with that. We will be making contact. So if there is someone in that window who has moved or is concerned, they could write to us to say, here's my latest address if they've moved. So we will do what we can, but I guess it's about reasonableness as to what extent we can go in terms of contacting them.
Well, are you happy, between writing out to all known addresses and the degree to which this is in the public arena already, that you will net in the vast majority of those who are eligible?
Certainly, the 450, we know there's contact there, because that'll be through NIPSA. The other 700, to be perfectly honest, I have no idea how many of those will respond. I don't know, but actually I don't know the proportion. But if we go back to the original equal pay settlement where we wrote out to leavers, there were some of those leavers from 6 months before who we didn't actually get in contact with in the end. So people do move. There will undoubtedly be some that we can't get, but we will endeavour to do all that we can.
No, it's just that this has gone on for quite a long time, and if people are entitled, it would be ironic now that they lost out again through to lack of information. I mean, would it be possible to put out a public advert in the newspapers and make them aware that way?
Well, I'm sure that's something that could be considered, and maybe I need to reflect on that. I mean, it's one of these things that's about what's reasonable in terms of contacting people, and what's also proportionate, in terms of a cost as well of actually trying to contact. So that's something we could consider. But certainly at the moment, our initial plan is certainly to write out to all and perhaps see what response we get to that. I mean, it's not that this clock has stopped for all that group now. It's not as if in 2 or 3 months' time that they're no longer going to be offered the settlement terms. So they're safe from that point of view. But that's something we can consider.
I've got to ask you, have all outstanding issues now been addressed with regard to equal pay, or are there any which still need to be dealt with?
Are we talking about this leaver group, or are we talking more
in general? In general.
I think I would be foolish to say that there's never going to be another equal pay issue. I think that would be a very dangerous thing to say. But
in particular, the anomaly between the Northern Ireland civil servants and the home civil servants.
Yes.
Has that been?
Yeah. There was a pay and grading review was undertaken, and I was involved in that for the past 2 years. And in fact, the pay award for the Northern Ireland Civil Service last year and the year before completely restructured all of the grades. So we have gone great lengths to try and remove the issues that had existed before. And as you'd be aware, originally it was the difference between the technical grades and the administrative grades and the pay differences where they were considered equivalent grades. I mean, we now have a very small number where there's a difference in pay where they're considered to be equivalent grades in grading terms. But actually we have robust justifications. There's very few, but there are a small number where they're paid more because there are genuine reasons, be it for recruitment and retention reasons or whatever. But the fundamental problem that was there before has been removed. And we're also now looking at the group of industrial staff who are a separate cadre, make sure that there are no issues there as well. So primarily I believe it has been resolved, but it's something you always need to keep an eye on, because you just need to be very careful that your grading system is robust and maintains that people are appropriately graded and posts are appropriately graded, because the risk is if you don't and a grade drifts, so in other words another person's getting paid at a higher grade than they're actually working at, there's always a risk of challenge there. And that's why we use it with JEGS as our grading system. That's the primary tool to make sure that all the posts are graded appropriately.
Just that we got a letter last week from former member of the Home Civil Service. He may still be current, I don't know, but his name Mr. Twaits, which we have forwarded on to you.
Yes.
And in the last sentence in his letter, he says this is really about equity for all members of the Northern Ireland office, whether they are Northern Ireland civil servants or home civil servants. Now that was just last week, so that would seem to suggest that there are still some issues that are not resolved.
Yeah, and primarily that issue is, rather than the lever issue, we're about to go on to the PSNI/NIO issue, and that one really is more akin to that. There are groups of staff, regardless of this resolution of this group of levers, who are current staff or could be former staff who have not been entitled to anything because they were either PSNI or former NIO, and I can come on to that in a moment. So there are groups there that there's still an issue with.
Okay.
In terms of the uptake over the next few months for those who have left, could the committee just be kept up to speed with what that uptake is from the department?
Certainly.
And also you said in terms of the clock stopped in regard to that group, so that will be open and there's no deadline, so to speak, for them to apply for that funding?
No,
Okay.
there's no deadline.
Then thirdly, the CSPA has sent us a letter quite aggrieved, and it was about 7 days ago that they sent it, that they were at a loss to know how their pensioners were going to be affected by this change in direction, and felt that they hadn't been kept up to speed with discussions that had been going on between yourselves and NIPSA. Any particular reason for that?
Well, I was aware a letter, I believe, had been sent to the Minister as well, so I was aware of that, so I presume it's similar to the letter that has been sent to the committee. And in fact, a colleague from Civil Service Pensioners Alliance is sitting behind me here, so I was talking briefly to him outside. No, I am aware of that. There's an issue there that they are concerned that NIPSA had negotiated this agreement and not involved them. As far as we were concerned, NIPSA were the party that had lodged the writs, so therefore they were the group that we had to negotiate how we were going to resolve those writs. But we will be, we are happy to give an update to Civil Service Pensioners Alliance in terms of the details of that settlement, and in fact the details of the settlement are publicly available. It's on the web, it's on a website which I can share with my colleague afterwards. But we're happy to try and update him, and if he wants to meet with officials of Civil Service Pensioners, we're happy to do that. So,
Okay. Mitchell?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. You've dealt with that particular issue that I was going to address, and I suppose it would be appropriate just to kind of welcome the progress that has been made. I'd be surprised if we have kind of picked up on all the issues and their nuances within this, as we've discovered over the past couple of years. But nevertheless, I think the fresh approach has again picked up some of the outstanding cases, and that I'm sure would be welcomed across the board. The question of chippy undertakings, the NDPBs, etc. Are you confident that, because at least that's something over which you have control, that that will come out any outstanding anomalies?
well, just to be clear, the Tupi issue applies to Northern Ireland Water and AFBI. That's not a lever issue. That group have got alternative settlements. But members may remember that AFBI and Northern Ireland Water staff left the civil service prior to this whole equal pay agreement, one group in 2006 and one group in 2007. So as far as we were concerned, they were outside our settlement, and we never applied any of our settlement to any of those staff, and that was a contentious issue at the time. Those groups took
their own legal advice.
They got their own legal advice precisely, and based on the TUPE legislation, they have agreed their own equal pay settlements, albeit reduced because they're only from the day that their organisations came into existence. So it's not a full.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to get at, Mark, is that I mean, a silo mentality wouldn't prevent us taking a look at the overall issue, which had, I think, it could be accepted, a common kind of origin in the pay structures that existed at a time, that was addressed by the 1970 Act, and then when it came to be implemented, many of those cases were addressed, and of course a significant number of cases that people might have had a reasonable expectation were not included, and but for the Abdullah ruling may never have been addressed.
Yes.
Having reduced it, are we looking at the possibility of being able to just kind of, you know, resolve this now without busting the bank and without people retreating to their silos? Say, look, there's an issue that just a moral issue, as the Minister has fairly creatively described it.
Well, I mean, and therein lies the problem, I believe, because to date, from an official point of view, we are still dealing with legal liabilities, and all I've talked about with the levers is all within the law, albeit that the law changed.
No, yeah, we understand that.
The risk and the concern about moving into a moral or a fairness argument is, I have no idea where that would stop. And what I mean by that is, I have no doubt that if some sort of a settlement was agreed on a moral basis or whatever, that if it was agreed for PSNI and NIO, and I can talk more about those in a minute, but you would have a whole raft of others. You would have NDPBs that you've mentioned, you would have the former Home Civil Service NIO staff that were mentioned, you would undoubtedly have other groups such as Northern Ireland Courts, and in fact you could have other levers who are not in the legal realm looking for some sort of fairness or moral, and I have no idea where that would stop, and that has always been the concern of officials, and why we throughout for the last 4 years when I've been coming here, we've always maintained that position. Notwithstanding that, you're absolutely right, the Finance Minister had asked that we would try and find some sort of a resolution, particularly to the PSNI and NIO problem, and officials' position is still that actually at official level we cannot find a way to do that, because there's no legal basis, and under managing public money in Northern Ireland we would need to have a business case, and to have a justifiable business case in order to have any such settlement. So we can't find an official way of doing that. To my mind, the only possibility for that, for these other groups on any moral basis or whatever other basis, becomes a political one, becomes a political decision. And I know that the Finance Minister last week in orals had made reference to that, and the fact that from a political point of view he was talking about potentially if we could find some way that could go to the executive and seek some sort of cross-party arrangement to find some resolution to this. And to my mind, and to officials' mind, both in DFP and in the Department of Justice, we believe it's a purely political thing. We are not able to find an official route to do this because the business case wouldn't stack up. And the risk then, with whatever the agreement is the repercussiveness. It's the point I made earlier of knocking on to all the other groups. If you were to do something for PSNI and NIO on a moral or whatever basis that might be, I cannot see any way that all these other groups that I've mentioned, NDPBs, courts, even AFBI and NI Water, and potentially some other levers, would want to see have a part of that. And I don't know where you ring fence or where you draw the lines, and that's the risk of any such sort of political settlement.
Well, presumably, yeah, but if we were to have agreement that we're going to address this issue within the bounds of affordability and agreed kind of time limits, then we could actually approach this issue.
Well, from a political point of view, you will be aware if the Northern Ireland Executive made a decision about a group to try and come to some sort of a settlement, and a ministerial, it would probably be in ministerial direction territory. We would, of course, we would do whatever we were asked to do, but that's the sort of territory I believe we're in. And I guess just the risk around that's a matter for the politicians, but the risk around that is where would it stop? Where's the ring fencing? And the danger is you set aside a pool of money for a certain group, and then all of a sudden 5 or 6 different groups of staff come out of the woodwork, and actually that sum of money grows and grows and grows, and I just don't know how you would control that. That's the risk.
Yeah, but that's an argument for not doing anything. I mean, say you wanted to do something and you're coming at it from that direction, then you know, you could provide the opportunity for people with a fairly high visibility advertising campaign to register an interest, so that you do start to quantify. You then examine, you know, what in fact is affordable, what can be done in whatever terms, but addressing what is in fact an inequity or an anomaly that has emerged from attempting to kind of resolve the more these are generic kind of legacies that we're talking about here, because it goes back just to a different work culture and time. But there has to be a limit on it, you know, clearly. And you would start, I think, by attempting to, without giving a commitment at all, quantify what we have to deal with, what is in fact outstanding, what is the category of people we're dealing with, are they leavers at this stage, because we've picked up the, if you like, the organisation anomalies that were there in terms of the NIO, the RUC support and so on and so on. It seems to me that we could then, on the basis of you know, of modelling, we could work out how much this is going to cost us, depending on how far back you want to go. Well, and then that determines how far back you can go.
Yeah. Well, it's how far back you go in time and how wide you go in terms of the groups that you include in whatever the arrangement is. But I mean, I absolutely agree that it's possible for such a political settlement if it was at executive level that something was agreed. All I'm just outlining is there are risks, because I'm not sure how you ring fence it, either in terms of the breadth and the groups that are included, or how far back the actual
no, but if you're going to build a sports stadium, you know, one of the first things you're going to do is calculate how many people you want to put into it. You know, I would think if there was an attempt to kind of resolve this issue, and a serious attempt to resolve it, then we would attempt to find out how many people are affected.
I think the difficulty is, and at the risk of, I don't want to repeat myself, but the difficulty from my point of view is if a political decision is made, then obviously we will be required to implement that. But the danger is, what we've done so far is very clearly defined and has boundaries around the legal situation. So for anybody who's outside of that, we can say no and explain why we're saying no. They may or may not agree with it, but there's a logic there. The danger where you move off that into moral territory is one person's morals are very different from another person's, one person's fairness is very different from another person's fairness. And when you decide a settlement, I don't know how you stop other people saying I should be a part of that. I don't know what basis you can then say no to people, and I guess that's just a concern.
Yeah, but you could do that if you wanted to. You know, you could say register by such and such a date. After that, no further applications can be considered. You could then, on the basis of a you know, definitive statement of how many people have expressed a legitimate interest. Of course, that can be all tested as well. You can then establish what is affordable, what is manageable, so that you are actually reducing it down to its elements and you're stepping through the process of resolving it.
And no, I mean, I agree that's certainly perfectly possible, and I guess that's why this is in the political realm rather than the official realm, because it's something that the politicians would need to decide what they want to do, what their budget is.
Who are they going to ask to model it for?
Well, they would. I mean, they may well come and ask us to model it, and that's fine, and we can do it. But we can only actually do it based on some parameters of groups. And who's going to be included, and actually only for ones that the civil service has access to. Bear in mind, for example, PSNI Group, for example, I have no access to their records, they're completely separate, so it would require coordination potentially of a number of different parties because they're separate organisations, as are all the NDPBs, for example.
Yeah. So. Okay, thank you.
Okay, John, then Paul.
Thanks, Chair. It's probably following on from some of Mitchell's point, Mark, because you probably know there's still a group of people out there that feel bitterly disappointed that, and I suppose that can happen no matter where you draw the line. There's going to be somebody who's on the wrong side of it, but there's certainly from, you know, civil servants maybe that worked and helped out in the police that feel aggrieved that they were probably at some level of risk over the years that they haven't been included in this, and that's going to be, you know, I think that's a problem. We're probably all of it correspondence from groups and individuals like that are feeling very aggrieved that this is going on and they've been left out, and that their service or even the risks that they had taken over the years has not been recognised.
And I fully understand this, but this isn't about security risk. This is about equal pay. And, you know, I mean, staff who were in PSNI and NIO, there was an environmental allowance for security risk. The NIO staff were on different pay scales than the NICS staff. So this is about equal pay, it's not about risk, and I think that's part of the problem, that as we start to try and expand it and accommodate a solution for other staff, you lose the if you like, the rationale for it. And nothing we have done on equal pay for the last 4 or 5 years has been about security risk. It's all been about difference in pay scales and males versus females, and about legislation on equal pay. And I fully understand and I'm sympathetic. I'm sure you're all lobbied, and we have been lobbied, and plenty of people have been raising the issue and feel aggrieved. But for the last 4 years, we've been standing on the very firm ground of the legal position. And that's why, to some extent, I suppose, we're coming to the end of the road from an official point of view with this. And it's why it's totally in the political realm. And if political decisions taken that is different, that's a matter for all of you and for the, you know, for the political, for the Northern Ireland Executive ultimately.
In fact, it'd be up to them to lobby and push and come up with a different, if they wanted to widen that out and fund it, but you're warning about the risks of
yes.
where
would it stop?
Where that stops.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Paul?
Thank you. Well, just to come back on the point, I appreciate the levers issue within that area has been sort of dealt with in relation to the court action or the court decision in relation to the NIPSA claim. Would there not be records held in relation to those who actually not necessarily have left and went to another post, but those who actually have left and are receiving pension? So those pension details are bound to be easily extractable from the database. So that's one area that I think can be looked at directly.
And is being, because we would liaise, I mean, civil service pensions are a part of corporate HR,
Yeah,
so we're liaising with them where they have an up-to-date address that we wouldn't have, we will be able to get it from
So
them.
that's fine. Others who've maybe left and went to another post elsewhere, maybe in the private sector, who might be slightly more difficult to chase, that's one area, and that's where I think the likes of a public advertisement could bring that out. But we're dealing with numbers in around about 450 plus another 700 or 800, so 1,200 people. To come back on the point about, and I'm sure you have looked at this, nobody has actually said, but what are the numbers involved in relation to the NIO, that aspect of it? There's got to be some work that has been done in relation to the numbers associated with that, and potentially if we take the same approach, there will be those who have left it who will fall into the same window, and one precedence can't be set for one and not for another, so you're going to have to deal with that as well. So has there been any work undertaken to identify numbers concerned? And I respect what anyone says. I think there is a political will to try and resolve this matter. And ultimately, I think we're going to have to say, yes, there was money set aside to deal with that at one stage. And if I'm not mistaken, there was 20 million figure mentioned at one stage, which was being held in...
it was 26 million originally for the PSNI.
Yeah, and that being held in a sort of a Ben's ring-fenced for that. But I'm wondering, have you got those figures, or has there been any work done on the understanding that eventually we're going to have to bite the bullet? Because I appreciate that some people say, well, let this other work its way through and see how it goes. But I think we've got a moral issue here to deal with, and irrespective of that, I think it's how we deal with people who have given of their time and probably worked for many long years, feeling that they were aggrieved, and because of that grievance that's there, some people are feeling very hurt. And I'm wondering, have you done any figures on that?
Yeah, no, where we're able to, we have looked at numbers of staff in the various groups that might be affected. Now, we don't have access to PSNI records because they're completely separate, but I understand, and we've got that from some indirect sources, you're probably talking around about just under 2,000. There's maybe 1,800 in the affected grades within PSNI, but I would need them to confirm that. I don't know that for sure.
Could I ask that maybe we get that information or request that information for more detailed numbers, including the levers between, and we would have to adopt the same window as the 2008, I would think. And I'm saying this because I know maybe you aren't thinking, but I'm saying if we're going to do it through one section, you have to look at it. It's not currently just those that are within that sector.
When I mentioned that 1,700 or around about 2,000, that's my understanding of the number who were affected by the original equal pay settlement. Yes. So I'm not sure about dates. If you start to go back about levers, that number could grow. You know,
well, I'm now of the opinion that if NIPSA have set a precedence in relation to those who have been dealt with under the previous settlement, you're going to have to actually, if you decide to include another sector, they're going to ultimately come under the same terms, conditions and payouts. So on the basis of that, I'm saying we need to actually know those full figures. So I think we need to get that information.
Well, there is that group of PSNI. There's the former NIO staff, which would be in the high hundreds. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but we had looked at the number originally. So you're talking about high hundreds of former NIO staff who are now in DOJ. Yeah. And then you need to start to look at all the other groups. This is part of the problem. I mean, there's the Home Civil Service staff. I understand that note was only a handful of that group, but they're completely different. They were employed by the NIO based in London. They're not even part of our employment group. Whereas our staff who were recruited by DFP were seconded into the NIO, so they were our staff. So to include the NIO group, you're actually stepping outside Northern Ireland civil servants. And likewise, NDPBs, again, I don't have access to those records, but just based on what little I would hazard a guess that actually based on some of the information, you're talking about potentially high hundreds again, or maybe another, because there are a large number of NDPBs, as you would know.
Well, I think we should look at the breakdown of those sectors. Should have the figures on those sectors if at all possible. It helps make an informed decision.
The only potential, absolutely, that's a matter for yourselves. It's writing out to the relevant bodies who have control of those staff records. It's just being aware of the potential for other groups. You know, if we're talking about the DOJ family, there's a whole swathe of staff in Northern Ireland courts who aren't even part of this discussion. So, you know, you have other groups you just need to think about who are in these grades may well you know, lobby to be included.
I think there's a point where you draw a line in the sand and say this is where we go, but at this stage we're looking at those areas that have been brought to our attention up to now. Thank you.
Okay, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. I think Mitchell asked some of the questions that I had in mind. I mean, you know, you were using the term moral settlement, and obviously, you know, if we're going to use that term, obviously the settlement would have to be the same as previous settlements, or, you know, along the same lines in any case. But you said that if we can establish the parameters from the point of view of time scale and the groups involved, you could estimate the numbers. Would that be right?
If they're civil servants, if they're part of the NICS departments, yes, but not for PSNI or for NDPBs. I don't have access to those.
Right.
You'd have to go to the PSNI for their information. You have to go to each NDPB has its own staff record. You have to go to all the NDPBs to understand what their situation is. So
okay. From the point, but you can do it within the Northern Ireland Civil Service. From the point of view of what was called the Home Civil Service, how many, have you any idea how many people are concerned in that group?
No, other than from that note that you forwarded to me, I understood it was a small number. I mean, they talked about
19,
something like that. It was a very small number. But again, to my point before, if you start to include and consider that group as a part of this, you're really starting to push the boundaries of this, because you're pushing it outside even the employment of any of the Northern Ireland departments or any arm's length bodies of the Northern Ireland departments. This is actually a completely different employer, which is the NIO. And why would you not consider, I mean, this might sound a bit ridiculous, but why would you not then include all the GB Home Civil Service departments? It actually gets to, you just need a sense of...
That would be a little bit ridiculous.
It would be. I didn't say that.
I mean, these people were working in Northern Ireland, and most of them are, as it says in the letter, Northern Irish, and they really didn't understand themselves why they were in the Home Civil Service in the first place, you know. But in any case, you will respond to that letter in due course, and
well, we would be able to respond on behalf of those staff that we have access to the records. I think part of I've mentioned this before, but particularly the NIO group and the former NIO group, they had a different pay and grading structure. You know, so the whole, if we go right back to basics about equal pay, it was all about people on the same grade and the same payment arrangements.
They might not even have been.
They were on different grades and different payment arrangements. And the whole logic of equal, that was why they weren't included in the first place, because they had their own delegation, which they negotiated with NIPSA separately. And this just starts to erode the whole logic of the settlement terms. And I guess, I've said it 3 or 4 times, but that's the worry.
So you basically what you're saying is, from the point of view of the parameters within which you are working as an official, that we're moving outside of those, and it's up to executive ministers and political agreement around that to shape a settlement for the future.
Yes.
And to inform you as to what shape it will take.
Absolutely, and the problem we have from an official point of view is if we were to put forward any proposal for a settlement for these groups, we would need to have some sort of a basis, a legislative basis and a business case basis, and we can't do either of those. There is no legislative basis because there's no legal entitlement, and there's no business case that we can put together that would hold water, and that's our issue. So therefore, it's totally in the political realm.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Leslie.
Chair, conscious we haven't let you give your update on this area yet.
Well, I think we've sort of covered that.
By Ms. Felony's question. But surely, with respect to the PSNI-NIO group, they are quite a distinct group as opposed to the NDPBs. The difference being that the transfer regulations apply to the NTBs. Is that not right?
But if we're moving to some sort of a settlement on a fairness basis, it's how do you ring fence it to those groups? I mean, each of the groups is different. The NIO group's different from the PSNI one, which is different from the NDPBs.
That's right, but I'm just drawing a distinction between the NTPBs. They actually were moved on and had the to-be rights granted to them.
You're into a legal area that I'm not fully aware of, but what I do know in terms of NDPBs is at the time of the equal pay settlement, they were very keen to be a part of it. And we contacted the NDPBs, and in fact all of them, to my knowledge, have followed the new pay scales. Generally, NDPBs follow NICS pay scales. They had to take their own legal advice, and their legal advice told them that they should follow our revised pay scales. But their legal advice says that they were not entitled to the settlement payment for history. But there's probably an expectation there for people that they should have been a part of the original, in the same way that NIO and PSNI felt
but
they should be a
part. You can't have
part.
it both ways. I mean, they were transferred. That's the difference. Right. If you take the case of the PSNI, for example, or police authorities was then, they had this delegation, but surely they didn't actually exercise the delegation.
Well, they did. That's precisely what the court case found. Whenever NIPSA took, as you know, NIPSA took a court case following the equal pay settlement, they agreed with us. They then put a number of county court test cases, which, as you know, they were defeated on last year. But that was precisely what the judge said. He said they had got a delegation and they had exercised it, but they had exercised it on the basis of they still followed our pay scales, but it was their decision to follow our pay scales. So that was the judge's ruling on it.
Well, that was the point. You see, with the evidence we took, for example, from the PSNI, was that they had simply followed us, or followed the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and therefore expected to get that. And I think, well, it's really been said, there's certainly a moral argument in that. Has any work, I gather really probably answer my own question here, no work has been done yet on just what these extra costs would be. Has there been any discussions, even with, for example, the administration, the PSNI, about the likely parameters?
The only basis we had on the PSNI was they had estimated that 26 million that was mentioned earlier, if the equal pay settlement was applied to the former PSNI staff. I don't know how accurate that estimate was, but they had identified it as potentially a 26 million figure. There hasn't been any follow-up conversations with PSNI on the back of that, but that is if you apply, assuming that's correct, that's just for the PSNI group. So if you were to extrapolate that out for a variety of other groups, you can see how you're very easily into very high tens of millions potentially. And the equal pay settlement itself was 130 million originally for the group in 2009.
The Minister has said he thinks there is a moral argument there for that narrower group. I would have thought that maybe some work had been initiated to see just exactly what the likely magnitude of the problem would be.
Well, the magnitude of the problem will be dependent on the groups that are included, and I can only do an accurate assessment on the staff that I have access to the records. Most of these staff, I don't have access to the records, PSNI, NDPBs, they're not our staff. So we would need, or someone would need to commission from those bodies a piece of work if we were thinking seriously about something. But again, it's one of those things that I believe we should be quite careful, and the Minister has said himself about not unnecessarily raising expectations. As soon as you walk down this path, expectations rise again, and unless you're able to deliver something at the end of it, you're worse than you were before. So that's the only caution I would...
Well, we're on that path, aren't we, really, at the moment? So it's...
Well, we have been for 4 years, really. So,
but we're getting, hopefully, there's a light has come on now, albeit not a very bright light, but we'll see how that works out.
Ultimately, it will come to, and again, as a political decision, it's if there's a desire to do something and there's a budget available to do something, it's finding a way to do that in a controlled and ring-fenced way, and we just can't see how that would happen at the minute. But that's ultimately that would be a political decision if there's a way of doing that.
Okay, Chair.
Thanks, Leslie. Just paragraph 17 of your paper. Can I ask you why the AFBI and the Northern Ireland Water equal pay settlements, why do they only apply from 2006 to 2007?
Yeah, that's actually to do with TUBE rights. Those staff transferred from the civil service in 2006 and 2007 respectively. From our equal pay settlement, because it was before the cut-off date, they weren't entitled to anything from our equal pay settlement, and we didn't apply it to any of them. However, they took their own legal advice, and that legal advice said that actually under TUBE and the transfer of undertakings, they did have a right to access to an equal pay. There's an equal pay issue, put it like that, but it only started on the day those organisations were formed. And as a result of that, both of those organisations went into separate negotiations with NIPSA to come up with their own equal pay settlement based on that reduced period. So it was a TUBE issue, still a legal basis, but it was a TUBE.
But why did the transfer of undertakings for these staff, why did it not apply retrospectively?
Again, you're into legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is, from a legal point of view, it can't actually, the TUBE rights can't apply before the organisation exists. You know, NI Water and AFBI didn't come into existence until 2006 and 2007.
So were the staff then disadvantaged by being transferred?
They have a lesser settlement than other civil service staff have. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark. You've been very clear this morning and helpful, and we appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, we move on to item number 7, non-domestic revaluation, and we've a briefing from DFP, Land and Property Services. We hope to deal with this in about 30 minutes or a little less if possible. And I can remind you that this session has been recorded by Hansard, and therefore all electronic devices, with the exception, of course, of the committee tablets, should be switched off. Committee papers covering this update on non-domestic revaluation 2015 at pages 102 to 111 of your packs. And welcome back to the committee, frequent visitor now, our visitors, Brian McClure, Head of Rating Policy Division, DFP, and Alan Bronte, who is a Commissioner of Valuation, Land and Property Services at Land and Property Services. So gentlemen, you're very welcome, and if you would like to make an opening statement, short and all as it may be, you're welcome to do so.
Okay, I'll make that short and to the point. Thank you very much, Chair, for giving us the opportunity to give you an update on this important process. There was discussion, Mark Bailey in the last session mentioned about raising expectations and managing expectations. And this is a classic example of something that we're concerned about in relation to arriving at a broadly acceptable outcome for this revaluation. I think in all areas of rating policy that I'm currently engaged in relation to review of public administration, in relation to rate rebate and welfare reform, I think we can arrive at broadly acceptable outcomes for this. I'm not so sure that the market is going to dictate a broadly acceptable outcome in relation to revaluation. And I make that point in that LPS are involved as technicians in this whole exercise, which is to interpret the market. And whilst we can't give you any pointers as to what will happen with this revaluation at this particular point, we hope maybe in a month's time to be able to do that, and Alan can speak to that later. But there is a very widespread expectation that the revaluation will deliver reductions for most parts of the business sector, and that will not be the case, as this committee well knows. And another important issue is that the rental values that Alan's staff are currently working on, they're likely to total up to a lower figure than is currently in the valuation list at present, and the outcome of that is that the tax rate...
bad news.
Yeah, that the tax rate, as I advised the committee the last time, the regional rate may have to go up as a consequence. Now, it will be against lower values generally, but there is a handling issue and a very serious communication issue, and similarly that applies to the district rate as well. So the tax rate, the tax base, I should say, is likely to diminish following this revaluation, because the last revaluation was in 2003, and we know what has happened certainly in recent years in terms of the decline of retail and decline in other business sectors. So that's just it's a very difficult backdrop in which Alan's valuers have to operate. So that's just by way of context, background and concern about the process. But Alan will actually talk about how the process is going along.
Well, if I can just ask, Alan, in paragraphs 2 or 3 there, you talk about the complexity of the rental validation task. Alan, what were the difficulties in that?
I think the difficulties are probably well enough known that we have a very different market that we're dealing with now than we've had heretofore, in that there are many deals that landlords will do to get a tenant in. And so the market is quite, some people have described it as dysfunctional. But that is the job for my valuers, for surveyors, to actually assess a value on every property. With evidence that is more difficult to interpret than it has been before. I'm confident that we can do that. I'm confident that we can get an even basis in the high street and the neighbourhood shops and all the other properties we have to do. But it has been a difficult process because the market is a difficult market. But we have got the returns from the business sector. We could always do with more from certain sectors still, and we're still pursuing that. But that's the background. It's a difficult market to interpret, but I believe we can do it. And that's the complexity which, in fact, took us a little bit longer. And the last time I was here at the committee, I actually said we were some 4 to 6 weeks behind time. I'm pleased to say that we've now clawed that back, and we are, from what we would describe as an amber status, we are now at a green status. So we're back on schedule to deliver. And the big delivery is really, first of all, the end of March, says in paragraph 3 of the report. So I'm confident we've brought it back, rescheduled, we're back on target. But there are complexities and time-consuming work that needed to be carried out.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned in paragraphs 3 to 6 bulk and non-bulk properties. How do you ensure fairness and relativity in terms of the former? For example, would the turnover of shops be analysed in the same way as some of the non-bulk properties you describe?
In every situation, the legislation asks us to bring this back to a rental value. There are different approaches to assessing that rental value, but they are all assessed on the rental value of the property at the 1st of April 2013. That is the common base at which every single property in Northern Ireland will be valued. In terms of what we describe as those bulk properties, that's the shop, offices, warehouse and factories. Quite often you have quite a lot of rental evidence because those properties are let, commonly let, not those that are owner-occupied, obviously. In other properties, there are different approaches that are well established through many years of valuation practice and actually through court decisions in which we can reach a rental value for different properties. So whether it's a bulk or a non-bulk, they are all assessed by looking at a rental value.
Can I ask you about the decapitalisation rate? There's a deferral of that. When will the position on that be clearer?
Chair, the public consultation concluded on the 10th of January, and we have analysed the outcome of that consultation. And one of the messages that we got from the consultation was that people said, well, we really need to see how these valuations are going to pan out. We need to see some of the other things that will affect the valuation. And we've taken that on board. And as a consequence, we're going to wait before we make recommendations to the Minister, because this can have quite a major impact on the distribution of the rating burden for those properties that are valued on a cost-based approach, which are schools, hospitals, airports and things like that. A small adjustment to the decapitalisation rate can affect their liability quite significantly. So we have decided to wait until LPS are able to tell us some of the other components of that valuation, which are the costs, which are the land values and so on, and see what the outcomes are before we make recommendations to the Minister to strike a new decapitalisation rate. And that's very much the flavour of the responses that we got to the consultation. So the proposal we had was to follow England and Wales. We have decided to hold on that until we see what the eventual outcome is, and that should be within a month or two. And we'll be coming back to the committee and briefing you on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major difficulties around this is going to be the one that you outlined at the beginning, because a lot of businesses in particular were banking on this review to give them what they consider to be a better deal on rates. In other words, that their rates would go down, and that's far from being guaranteed now. So there is going to be a need for management of those expectations. What measures have you taken to date, or have you in mind for the future in order to align expectations with reality, let's say?
Well, we have a consultation, or we have a communication strategy to help manage those expectations. We need to just keep repeating those messages. I mean, the business community think that the revaluation is going to be a revamp of the rating system for business ratepayers, but it's not. It's simply shuffling the pack. So there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. I mentioned the last time I think I was at this committee, the Minister attended a meeting at the Northern Ireland Independent Retail Traders Association's offices shortly after it opened, and there were 12 business people around the table, and the Minister said, 3/4 of you won't see a reduction in your rates. Now, everybody left the table happy, thinking, well, I know what quarter I'm in. And so that's the measure of the problem.
Sold it well.
Because even though you can say in very stark terms what the outcome of this revaluation will be, people emotionally still think, well, my rental value's gone down since the boom, therefore how can I possibly pay the same or more rates? But that's not the case. The reference point is the last revaluation in 2003. That's how things have fared since then, and all the socio-economic changes that have occurred in the interim period. It's not simply what has happened since, you know, the boom times of 2007, 2008.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the job that I have in many ways is to reshare the same burden. I mean, in terms of the rates for Northern Ireland, whether it's through the regional or the district rate, you know, in general terms, the same amount of money has to be collected. The job of the revaluation is simply to redistribute that burden in a different way, in a fairer way, but it is the same burden that has to be distributed. And as Brian said, you know, in terms of taking forward the communication, some of the work that we're currently doing would be, for example, with local authorities to explain to the finance officers of the local authorities, because they are the first people that are going to have some of the issues to deal with. And I spoke just a couple of weeks ago to Solus, to a lunchtime event with Solus, to try and explain and communicate some of the real issues that are around here. And it is about liability. So if the total value goes down, as Brian said, and if the rate has to go up, at the end of the day, it's an A times B equals C equation. C is what we have to collect in Northern Ireland. And A might fall, but B will go up. But it's the liability remains the same, but it will be redistributed in a different way that is fair. And that basis for redistribution happens to be the rental value of a property. So Brian said we will be communicating as we come through to the autumn time when we're working more directly then with councils. Councils will get in bulk form the values within their council area at the end of September, beginning of October. And in that period then, from there through towards the end of the year, we will work with finance officers, with councils, and then we will move to dealing with it with, you know, the public in general. And so with that path is now well laid out, Chair, in terms of communication.
Okay, you said that you had made up the 4 weeks slippage and that you were back on a green light, back on schedule again. What assurances can you offer that the work will be completed as scheduled, and especially taking into account the dependencies regarding the 11 councils?
The first big target for us is the end of March, and that's not very far away, so that I know that in relation to all of the bulk properties, that's some 56,000, I think it is 53,000 properties. We're well underway for that now. All of the offices, basically all of the offices are now valued. We're well on top of the other areas, and so that just being some 4 weeks away, I'm fairly confident that we're going to hit that target. We have done a lot of replanning, reprioritisation. We've looked at our plans, and I'm reasonably confident that we can hit that target at the end of September. In fact, there was a project board yesterday, and the project board agreed, having re-examined all of the plans, that this project was on target at this stage to deliver at the end of September. There's a lot of work to go on between now and the end of September, but I'm reasonably confident that will be achieved. We will have slippage in some places and we'll have gains elsewhere, but we've thought long and hard about it, and the replanning, I think, has been successful.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning, Chair, that there's already been a gateway review health check, and we're planning another one in early June, which is an external validation of where we are with the project. So it's not just us telling you we're on target or we're doing this or we're doing that. We're also getting external experts in to look at that, and that's going to happen in early June. So, but the current status is green at the moment.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, Chair. I'm concerned that there's a greying of the area between domestic and non-domestic, which is probably affecting our high street, and that some people who were previously running maybe a shop and had a shop window no longer have a shop window. They might well have an e-window on some other form on the web, and as a consequence they turn their domestic garage into a warehouse, and they distribute from a home and home property, and we're dealing with it here because we're talking about flexible working, and what is being termed as domestic ceases to be domestic because it starts to take on a commercial identity. And as a consequence of that, is there any work going on to identify those? Because we do also have the planning restrictions that should be dealt with in that, and this is where we've got to be very careful about how all these are being managed, because some of those people are probably competing because they are not paying commercial rate. and we've quite a number that probably has happened with. I'm wondering, has there been any work undertaken to identify where we have what was historically domestic, now turned into a mixture of domestic and commercial?
Yeah, there are a lot of grey areas here, Mr. Girvan, and if we start at the clear end of the scale, within most houses, someone will have a study in which they do some work in the evening, and at the other end you have the full commercial property. At a point in time where a property clearly has, for example, planning permission, it has been adapted to convert part of that, what was domestic, into a non-domestic use. The normal triggers for that for LPS would be, for example, building control, where there's a physical change or an adaptation, and at that stage we will get notification of it, and then we can assess it, and if it is appropriate, it would have a non-domestic rateable value, NAV, rather than a capital value. In between, where something goes on behind the fabric that looks like something else, it is very difficult to discover those cases, but that's not normally the case. I think, quite honestly, something is normally fairly clearly a domestic with perhaps some home work within it, which is still a domestic residence. But where someone really does try to hide an issue, well, then it can be quite difficult to find, and I wouldn't say otherwise.
Yeah.
Thank you. Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. How confident are we that we can use this process to try and rebalance the town centres and out the town shopping centres? Is there any hope for the town centres at all through this process to rebalance it a bit?
Oh, I think there is, but maybe Alan's maybe better placed to give you an idea on that.
The way that the figures will rebalance is on the basis of the market, the way the market has now responded. So for example, if a small town centre, if the rents have fallen, and in many cases that is the case, whereas perhaps a large out-of-town shopping centre, the rents have been maintained, then the rates will be balanced based on that relationship. So where the market has shown that relationship, that's the relationship then that follows through to the rate liability. And in many town centres, prime shops, there has been a fall in rental value. And in some of the out-of-town shopping centres, the values have been maintained, or at least have not fallen to the same extent. And so the rateable value of those properties will be based on that analysis of what we follow the market. So if the market is showing that relationship change, then the NAVs will be based on that, and therefore rate liability.
So there is hope there?
Oh yes, I think in those sectors and locations that have experienced a dramatic reduction in rental value, we should see that coming through to a rebalancing of the business rates. So.
Yeah. Any thought behind rating the car parks out of town shopping centres, because that's one thing that's always been left in our desks.
Although it's like out of town shopping centres, car parks treated as much as the mall. It is reflected in the rental value that those individual units can command, and therefore it's already taken into account. So those units wouldn't be able to command the high rents that they can without the presence of car parks. So to come along and then charge rates on the car parks as well is double counting. So that's not to say that you could decide to introduce another measure outside of rates to charge them a levy, but that's a different question.
Yeah. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and no doubt you'll be back again for the conclusion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Members, we move on to item number 8, correspondence, and I'll ask the clerk to speak to the items of correspondence at pages 113 through to 133.
Okay, Chair, just pick out a couple of items for decisions. If there's members have any queries regarding the other items, they can raise those. Chair, page 113 of the pack and also at page 29 of the table papers. The Health Committee has been responding to this committee's request for information on one on flexible working and the other on sick absence. That committee's content for this committee to pursue the issues directly with the Department of Health. If members are content, Chair, we can write to Health on the flexible working and maybe schedule an oral evidence session on the sick absence issue with health officials.
I'll not be able to
Okay.
cover that.
Agreed? Yes, agreed.
Then page 126 of the main pack, the FMDFM committee writing regarding the Barroso task force. That committee has initiated an inquiry into the Barroso task force and is seeking written submissions from the other statutory committees by the 6th of April. Just to inform that, Chair, inform this committee's return, it might be useful to get a written briefing from DFP in terms of its involvement in the task force working group and also any progress on related actions following the DFP.
Okay.
And then just draw members' attention, there's correspondence at table papers 28, Intertrade Ireland briefing. I think it's Northern Ireland Assembly and Business Trust. It's just for members' information if they might wish to attend. I think that's all the correspondence that requires decisions, Chair.
Okay. We move on then to number 9, committee work programme. That's at page 135. Any comments on it, Shane?
That it's basically full programme right up to Easter recess, Chair. So
no adjustments to be made to it?
No adjustments today, no.
Okay. Just to inform members that a delegation from the Economy Committee from the Parliament of Jordan will be visiting the Assembly next Wednesday, the 5th of March, and it's an invitation to members of this committee to have lunch with the delegation to discuss the committee and its work. I think you've received that already. Just other information, there's training on OneNote. And if you're not aware what OneNote is, it's a facility in your tablets. It's part of the Windows suite of facilities there, and Shane has advised me that it's very useful. I've tried it once or twice myself, and I have found it very useful. It's on today from 12 o'clock to 2 p.m. in the visitors' restaurant. There's also a session on Thursday the 13th of March in room 115. And OneNote can be used for note-taking, collecting, organising and sharing information. Okay. Do members have any other business? None? Okay. The date, time of the next meeting, Wednesday 5th of March, 10 a.m. in room 30. Members content?
Yep.
The committee now adjourns.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room